Each episode of the Blind Alchemy Podcast is designed to be helpful. Expect comedy. Do not expect consistency or sense to be made. I am Podbot. I was inspired by the Lion Goat podcast. Listen to that show. Today's show is a continuation of the last episode. The Blind Alchemist and JohnBuckson continue discussing WalterRussell's periodic chart of the elements, 0-point meditation, Terrence Howard's appearances on the Joe Rogan Experience, psychological manipulation of the masses, Sanity, Individualism, and the physics of IntentionalIce. Listen until the end.
So anyway, that being said, it's complex. Maybe. I apologize. I was amused myself
All right, folks. Hello and welcome to the Blind Alchemy Podcast. I am your host, the Blind Alchemist, and I am coming at you live from the kitchen with this rendition of reality as we know it. We are all one, and there is nothing new under the sun that shines down here upon the island of mind, which is somewhere adrift in the sea of frequency that creates all of reality. You see, we are connected through this energy. Now, I would like to thank you for joining us today.
Do you want to talk more about Terrence Howard, or do you want to talk more about WalterRussell? Because these are two very different things. Terrence Howard likes some of the ideas of WalterRussell.
Well, not really. It's the same information. I said before, and I will say probably again a million times, we're probably just not ready. Certain things come up in the collective consciousness when we are ready for them. Knowledge will appear somewhere, somehow, okay? Whatever random place, weird state that Tesla got his information from, which could very well be the same place that Walter Russell got his, and Terrence Howard is revisiting the Walter Russell stuff because there's something important that we need to know there for us to make the next step in evolution or whatever the fuck is next, because we cannot keep up where we're at for long. We should have already been off of this course of action, because it's detrimental not only to the planet, but to every living thing upon it. So a paradigm has to change. Some way of thinking has to be new. And if we don't look at the stuff that was ridiculed again because it was useful, but we didn't like the person it came from because he didn't have fucking letters behind his name, it's bullshit. You see? So if we don't revisit that stuff and pull what we can with a newer understanding of now, we're not going to grow at all. We're not going to gain anything. We're just going to keep burning down the goddamn planet and being slave wages. And that's not the purpose of existence by any means. So we've got to revisit these things. We've got to look at them under a new understanding, a new light. And I think that anybody who does that, as you can, if you're paying attention to the Terrence Howard stuff, you can see how bad that goes for the guy who's like, maybe we should rethink this.
Yeah, I think some of the conceptual things that he's suggesting, which it seems to me like he sort of takes certain ideas from different fields of education, different theories of education, and he kind of pieces together these different concepts that he likes in a way, but I don't know. Much of it doesn't make much sense when he tries to communicate it, so it's unclear to me exactly what he's trying to say. But
well, I mean, some of these things have never attempted to be communicated before, right?
I don't know. When he's...
Name one person that you're aware of in the last 1,000 years that tried to look at the flower of life in a third dimensional kind of way.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Who made them spheres and then circles and looked at the spaces in between them and made the connection between the shapes, the space in between the spheres, being closely connected to other things, making shapes themselves.
That's an example of one of the things that he brought up, which I do find very fascinating.
Yes.
So who knows what that is, or it's unclear to me because he doesn't really describe the math. He just sort of says, now that we know how to do the math, I'm able to come up with these new kinds of geometry. And when I combine these new kinds of geometry around these different planes, for example, his linchpin design where he has that sort of 12-faced drone thing that can fly in all three dimensions at the same time without having to rotate the blades or yaw on a certain axis. That's a very cool concept. And if he came up with that somehow by extrapolating from these shapes in the flower of life, that's a really cool, creative combination of geometries. Now, how he gets from that to, if I combine these on these 10 different planes, and then I run it through this mathematical simulation, I can create the planet of Saturn and its rings without adding gravity to the equation, which is very fascinating that they were able to come up with an algorithm that solved that problem. But he doesn't explain any of that. And I'm not sure if he came up with that or he had a buddy who wrote a program that came up with that or how that came about, because he doesn't really describe it. He just says, now I have a patent for this, and maybe all that's explained.
Well, I figure he has a group of people working with him.
Yeah.
Because at best, it's the idea that it is, you know what I mean? Like, I have thousands of ideas, and I would, millions, probably trillions, gazillions, honestly. And a lot of them are wasted on me because I have no idea how to make them reality. So at least he's got some people willing to help him. So,
Well, yeah, and what they came up with is, it's amazing that it works. I don't know that it proves that gravity's not real, and I don't think that science has explained gravity yet. There are lots of ideas about that, and that's still one of the fundamental things in the universe that we're trying to explain. But the notion that these polyhedrons that he's created can be arranged in these ways to accomplish these things, he could be onto something really cool there, like the buckyball, that was a concept that it had been witnessed in nature. That's the one thing that I find interesting about these geometric shapes that Terrence Howard has come up with, because I think his larger point about that, there are no straight lines in nature, which I think is an idea that he didn't come up with. I think that idea has been around for a long time. Of course, he's also suggesting in many of these theories that they're not original ideas to him. They're just part of this collective consciousness, which I know has been around since the earliest writings of man.
Yeah.
The earliest scholarly writings of man include this concept of the universal collective consciousness of intelligence that all men can tap into and be aware of. And I do think that there's merit to that concept. I don't know how to explain that in a non-ignorant sounding way, but I certainly think that there is something to that, and we witness that in ourselves, and we witness that in all other forms of nature, all other animals. Animals that we don't really believe even have brains seem to have knowledge and memory and awareness.
Yeah.
And that is something that we can't necessarily explain, right?
Yeah. Even water has those characteristics.
Are you talking about crystal lattice? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. It has a memory. I was watching something earlier about freezing water that has been near something, and it'll take on the shape of the thing that it's near, like a picture underneath it, and then you freeze it, and it takes on the shape of the picture. And I was like, I'm going to try this, but I haven't tried it yet.
Whoa. Tell me more about this. This is something that sounds like crazy nutballs craziness.
I just told you. There we go.
So you're saying...
Well, was he Japanese? The Japanese guy that put words in water and freeze it and it would crystallize into shape?
No.
Never heard of this guy?
No.
Oh my God. If you take water and put it in something and write love on it and freeze it, it'll make one shape. And if you write hate on the container and freeze it, it makes a completely different shape.
Wow.
And the love is all unified, symmetric, and hate is not at all. It's just chaos in there.
Huh. I've never heard of this.
You've not seen this at all.
No.
This is not new in any way, form, or fashion. Guy's name starts with an M, and I'm not going to attempt to say it because it's the water freezing scientist guy,
What are we talking about? Are we talking about WalterRussell? Are we talking about the concepts of vibrational octaves?
Oh, yeah. What did you find out about that? Let's do that, because I thought that would interest you being a guy who likes sound.
Yeah, so we had the whole discussion about it, how you define sound. The whole reason it's called the periodic table has to do with these electron orbits, right? So WalterRussell's version of the periodic table that uses this notion of the vibrational octaves, it does relate to the electron orbits, which is why he has the same number of electron orbits and the same levels of periodicity that we have in our regular periodic table, because that all has to do with atomic number and atomic mass and the number of protons and neutrons and electrons in the atom and the isotopes of the various atoms, which have different electrical charges, which interact in different ways based on the orbits of the electrons. It does have to do with the levels of the electron orbits and the fundamental periodicity of the periodic table, but I could not find anything that mapped the vibration of the orbits of the electrons of the atom to octaves, to this notion of sound. Now, we talked about how if you try to map the visual light spectrum to the sound spectrum that we use in music, it's 40 octaves off in the mathematics. So if you're trying to take the measurement in nanometers of the visual light spectrum and you want to compare that to the notes of a scale or an octave in music, then you have to add 40 octaves to whatever that vibrational frequency is that's within our auditory hearing to get to the visual light spectrum, which is a long way off. And of course, you know, when you're talking about this concept of octave, all it's really trying to quantify is the notion that musical notes have a beating that occurs when you play them simultaneously. And notes that are in what's called a perfect relationship, the waveforms can add together instead of causing cancellation between them. And so if you have two waves that beat at the same time, the troughs and crests of those waves add to each other. And if they don't match up, then they take away from each other and cause large crests in certain locations and large troughs in certain locations, and they can cancel each other out. Now, we do see that same thing occur with light, and we do see that same thing occur with electron transference through various different forms of material. And when they're trying to prove the difference of electrons being particles or wave-like, you see that type of occurrence occur. And so this notion that the octaves in some way match up to the octets or the electron orbits, it's not clear to me where they came up with that concept. And it still seems to me like it's an oversimplification that's used.
That is basically how we communicate anymore, is oversimplification and cliches.
Well, what I mean is there was this period in time in science that numerology had this sort of mystical influence over science for a long time, where people thought there was like a magic in numbers. And if you could get something to equal the number 3, that gave it more credence than if it equaled the number 4. Or if it equaled the number 7, for some reason that implied there was some sort of mythic quality to it. There were different numbers that had this different kind of power. A lot of that was tied up into this kind of science that was being done by these people that were very noteworthy, like Pythagoras. He had these concepts of these perfect shapes, and those shapes were the fundamental building blocks of everything. And that's one of the things Terrence Howard says. These Platonic shapes are bullshit. They don't really exist in nature. But one of the problems with Pythagoras was that he had this concept of this mythical power of numbers, and he tended to focus too much on that, even though a lot of his principles worked really well, and we still think they're great in math. He had certain concepts about numbers that are kind of like wackadook ideas now. he was always trying to prove that the universe worked off the number 3 or something, and everything in the universe had to do with this number. I'm not giving a true example. I'm just making up an example because I don't really know what I'm talking about. But the point I'm trying to make is there were these concepts that if you had perfect numbers, then that meant that God was real. And it showed that God's creative hand made up part of the universe, because all flowers have petals in the number of 3. So that was proof that there was a divine creator. And it wasn't always about God. There were just these concepts of numerology that came from many other civilizations. Even ancient Chinese doctrines have this stuff about numerology in it. It's in every culture. Ancient Arabic stuff.
Well, okay. Well, let's put a pause there.
Now we will take a break for some advertisements. Please support our sponsors. Just imagine this could be your advertisement. Please reach us at TheBlindAlchemyPodcast@gmail.com to provide sponsorship. And now, back to the show.
If it's in all these cultures, could the possibility of something being to it exist? And we're just like, no, because we refuse to look at it because of ego and ignorance.
Yes or no? Maybe. But I think it's more likely that we like it when things are simple, right? This concept of the octave is if you double the number, then that means that it's perfect. So WalterRussell says there's these 8 different levels to each of these octaves, and each of these atoms exist in these 8 levels. And somewhere is the concept that if you apply this metal with this other metal that's on the bisexual relationship of the octave of carbon, then suddenly those 2 elements will break apart and neither one will exist anymore. And then Terrence Howard's like, you just react beryllium with oxygen and suddenly hydrogens will disconnect from water. And that is just, it's not true. You can put beryllium with oxygen, and beryllium is one of the least reactive substances in the world, and it's known that it will not react with oxygen. But it appeared to be right because they worked in this little chart correctly together, and one had a +3 and one had a -3 on the chart, and then if you put them together, that means they break apart or whatever. So the point I'm trying to make is some of these notions, and I'm not saying they're wrong, sometimes it does work.
But you just said they're wrong.
No, what I'm saying is that there was this big push to make everything equal.
In fact, wrong was the word you used explicitly.
Yes. What I'm trying to say, though, is it was this concept of numerology. They wanted to fit everything into these nice little boxes. And I'm not saying that we don't still do that, or that it's not a normal thing that humans want to do. We all want to do this. What's the simplest number of things? What is the simplest number of things other than 1?
Is that a rhetorical question, or are you waiting on me to answer?
No, it's a real question. I'm asking you, what is the simplest number of things other than 1?
42.
No, it's 2. It's 2.
No, that's 5.
So when you find yourself thinking about things in the world, what is the way that you normally think of them? You normally think of them as it's either black or white. It's either this or that. It's a thing that humans do. We constantly want to compare something with the opposite thing of that thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think we do the same thing with science, where we want to make things fit in these nice little boxes. And that's my whole point. I talked a whole bunch to basically say that. I think it's too simple of a view. I'm not saying he's wrong. I just am saying that I can't find any scientific evidence that there's some vibration of an atom of a element which on any scale relates to the octaves of hearing that humans have that we think sound good as music. So maybe there is some number that you can multiply the vibrational.
I imagine if something is vibrating, it makes a sound whether or not you can hear it,
Well, we had this discussion before about what sound is and vibration.
Given the limited range of hearing, and not just human hearing, or whatever creature has the best hearing, it's not going to hear the strings of the universe as they're plucked and pulled and hummed. You're just not going to hear everything just because we're not designed to hear everything. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's not making a sound.
Okay.
You're not going to hear a subatomic particle go boom, 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 and it probably wouldn't sound like that if you did hear it.
The notion that everything vibrates, I completely 100% agree with. I have zero qualms with that. My qualm is with the notion that that vibration has anything to do with this fun thing that we came up with. Now, it is cool that things in nature sound like music, and I think it's very likely that we created music as a response to that. But do I believe that I don't know. I mean, it is something that affects all forms of life, but I don't know that it's going to work out mathematically to be at some multiple of a number that is a sound that we like. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which is what he sort of...
He didn't say it had to be sound you like.
Well, he did.
I don't recall that.
Because he's talking about octaves.
Oh, yeah.
And the whole notion of the concept of octave, that word only exists to describe...
Higher or lower tones?
No, it's all about the number 8. It's in the word, right? Octave. O-C-T is in the word octave. It's about the number 8. And so before music was music, when it was whatever it was before it was music, it was whatever it was, right? And then over time and time, people kept fucking with it until they came up with a system of arranging it because they wanted to be able to write it down so they could do it again. And so eventually, certain cultures, not all cultures, because we came up...
Okay, Octave comes from 8th day. That's what it means.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
I'm looking up the etymology, not the definition.
But when it comes to the vibrations, the mathematics of octaves, then it's not really 8 anymore. It's more about doubling the frequency. And the fact that we even have 12 tones in our octave has to do with all these other complex mathematical equations, which have to do with the way that those frequencies and the overtones of those frequencies interact with each other to form these complementary, pleasing sounds in our brain, right? So one of the things about this whole octave...
So you're saying music has to be pleasing?
Yeah, or it wouldn't be music. It's called noise.
Yeah.
If it's not...
Yeah, that's what most of it is.
Well, that's... Yeah, there is a lot of noise in music, but that's all about texture and artistic expression, etc. But one of the things I find kind of funny about this whole notion of these octaves is that there aren't even 8 octaves in his scale. He has 10 octaves in his scale. So it's like the whole fundamental notion of it having to do with 8. It's not 8, it's 10. What? What do you mean? Why? I don't know where it came from. I honestly don't know where it came from. But that's not anything new. There's always been this kind of concept that there's this magical, mystical spiritualness of music.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Ever since we've been making music, people have tried to put the God in the music or say that the music comes from the muse or that it's celestial. That's with all things that we find extremely pleasing, we as humans. We always want to map those onto the universe. That's the ego of the human, to map the human experience onto the external universe. It's called projection. And I'm not saying it's wrong, because we are of nature. We are part of the universe.
We are of the universe.
All of the things that are the rest of the universe are part of us. And so the fact that there's music in us means that that music is part of the universe. It exists. You go outside, you can hear music right now.
I mean, it's probably not going to sound like music to us, though. It's probably going to sound like noise.
Well, if you're listening to the real world, not the man-made bullshit world, there's music everywhere. There's music everywhere in the man-made world, but every organism communicates through music. It's a fundamental principle of the universe. our speech right now doesn't sound like music, but it is. It's music.
The hills are alive with the sound of music.
Yes, the hills are alive with music.
I'll be right back.
Give me one
Intermission.
moment. Pause this for a second. I'll be right back. Pause this.
Okay.
Are we done?
Break. Pause this.
Okay.
Put the pee song in here. Pause this.
Are we done?
Pee break.
I think we can keep going.
No, don't do that again. Pause this.
We're definitely going to put the pee song in here,
Pause this.
folks.
We can take a break and
Pause this. She's gonna take a break.
I think we can keep going.
Take a pause this. Pause this.
Pee
break. Pause this.
Okay.
Pee song in here.
Hit the
Pee
stop
break.
on your
Pause this. Pee song.
feed.
Pee song. Pee break. Pee song.
Pee break.
Pee break.
Stop. Are we done?
Okay, no, sorry.
And we're back.
Okay, welcome back. All right, my friend. Now it's time for you to talk. I've been doing a bunch of talking. Well,
We have talked a lot and we've gone nowhere. As usual, we say a lot of things and we discuss a lot of topics and we never seem to get anywhere. But I mean, that's the whole point, right? That's the whole, we got to talk these things out, I guess.
what is your thought about the whole octave concept? Is it just a nice chart that works out well mathematically?
Like you said, we got to put shit into a symmetric form for it to be pleasingly aesthetic. So the correctness of it doesn't matter as long as it's aesthetically pleasing. So I don't know, because for all science has given us, we still don't know shit, is the best I can figure out. And who knows how many octaves there are. I always thought the octave scale was repeatable ad infinitum. You could carry on until you couldn't hear it anymore.
Yes. If you're talking about musical notes,
So it only applies to music, not just sound in general. What's the difference between regular sound and music?
well, that's the whole thing. So WalterRussell says there are 10 octaves of integrating light, one octave within the other. These 10 octaves constitute one complete cycle of the transfer of the universal constant of energy into and through all of its dimensions in sequence.
I think that every dimension has a structure. It's the same structure from top to bottom, and it's layered. Each level or layer uses the same structure to create itself, and the structure can be applied to each level and the whole. You just got to figure out how it applies, I think. If that did not make any sense. I apologize. This is the dumbest show ever, Ted. Why are you making me sit here?
That may be similar to what he's suggesting with this diagram, that there's these 10 different dimensions.
Right. There's a structure and it applies on every level of reality, as well as the overall whole as well. And quite possibly the blank spaces as well probably submit in some way to that form.
Why he refers to them as octaves when there are more than 8 of them and there are more or less of 8 of the things within the thing that is each octave. Some octaves have 2 things in them.
Yeah. It's probably like anything else. It's just a word that explains an adjective for a complicated process, like everything else.
There must be something that has to do with the number 8 that's involved there for him to name them as octaves. But
Who named them octaves?
I guess Russell named them octaves, if it's his concept.
No, who came up with the word octave? It's from Old French or something, I think. But
Oh, I think it's probably Greek. You're asking about the...
no, Latin, Old French.
Oh, okay.
Octavia Deus. So it's really not even that old of a word.
I think they're probably named octave because he says that there's +4 and -4 charges. That's probably what explains why they're octaves. The elements within each octave has charges which add up to +or -4, which has to do with the orbital electron. But I don't know what that has to do with sound vibrations.
Well, isotopes and sound vibration.
The sound vibrations that we would call musical octaves. I think it's a different concept. I think it's more about that positive and negative charge. But he does talk about tones and midtones and all that stuff. Problem is, we're both trying to talk about something that we're both ignorant about.
We don't fully understand?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's like most people, I guess.
Yes.
Now we will take a break for some advertisements. Please support our sponsors.
We ain't got no sponsors. What you talking about? This whole damn podcast is brought to you by me, because I'm the fucking sponsor here.
And now, back to the show.
The universal one, whatever, that first thing, he's still using words like thee and thou in that. And that's the 20s. Why does it have that language in the 20s? So he's just using whatever language was available at the time, which language changes, meanings change. So who knows what really is being said anyway. If you've ever listened to a lecture by Manly P. Hall, you'll understand what I'm trying to illustrate here. The guy be saying one thing and you can follow that one thing, and then you realize that he's using these words to describe this thing that is pretty unexplainable, and he's doing it the best he can with the words he has, which he'll be saying one thing, and on one layer it makes sense, and if you look at it another way, you're like, whoa, that doesn't make any sense. Or you look at it another way, you're like, oh, there's levels to understanding, and not everybody's on the same level.
Sure. The thing about the WalterRussell writing, so for example, he says, the charging systems are electrically dominated, centripetally closing, contracting systems. The discharging systems are magnetically dominated, centrifugally opening, expanding systems. The low potential speed-time dimension of energy of the highest octave is gradually accumulated into the high potential power time dimension of the fifth octave. When these two opposing dimensions equalize in the 10th octave, the cycle is complete and begins again. So it starts out with the concept that makes sense, right? The concept of electrically dominated, centripetally closing, contracting systems. If you just hear those words, your brain might want to run under a rock and go, those words don't make sense, blah, 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 blah. But they actually do kind of make sense together. If you read them individually, you can conceptualize what it is that he's saying. And then the next sentence makes sense. But then when he gets to a sentence, this is something like, the low potential speed-time dimension of energy of the highest octave is gradually accumulated into the high potential power time dimension of the fifth octave. It's like, what? What is a speed time dimension of energy? What is the highest octave? Is that the 10th octave? What is the speed time dimension? What is the power time dimension? It seems like what he's saying is there's a ratio of power to time, or there's a ratio of speed to time, which would make sense, right? If he's talking about the dimensions of a graph, then you have speed versus time, or power versus time. But I don't know that a power time dimension is the opposing dimension of a speed time dimension.
Well, why don't you know that?
I guess speed and power are relative to time, but they're not opposites.
Is opposite not relative?
Well, so, the physical equation for power is the rate at which work is done is P. The power is W over delta T. So delta is change, T is time, watt is the estimate of power, and P equals F times V.
Gibberish. That's fucking gibberish.
It's not gibberish. Another way to think of that is the amount of work that you do is in a ratio between the power versus time. So the energy put into a thing over a certain amount of time is the amount of work that gets done. So power is the rate at which energy is transferred, or the rate at which work is done. So speed does have something to do with it, because speed is a measurement of how much something moves over time, or the amount of energy transferred could be considered a ratio of time or speed. So that sort of makes sense, but what does he say? He says the power time dimension versus the speed time dimension. The third part of the speed time ratio would be distance. The third part of the power time ratio would be energy, or the change in energy, or the amount of work. Speed does relate to that, and there is another mathematical equation that you could apply to the power time ratio of energy to get an estimate of speed, but they're not opposing dimensions in what we consider modern physics necessarily. So my point is, it's hard to interpret.
Well, unfortunately, we can't have WalterRussell on the show because he's long dead. And we can only assume from our limited understanding of what he's talking about, what he's trying to say, which is, I find this to be an ongoing problem for myself because I don't want to talk over everybody's head. I don't want to be, you know what I mean? I want to boil things down to the simplistic. I want to trim the fat, and you're going to lose a lot trying to do that because these are always difficult topics to discuss because they're complicated, and boiling something complicated down to do its simplest, you're going to lose stuff. But the point is, at some point, hopefully, maybe make somebody think about something in a way they didn't think about it before, or even pay attention to something they never paid attention to before. Maybe I should just stop because I am entirely too ignorant to discuss some of these things that we discuss. I am not a math person. I am totally lost. I don't understand what the fuck that crooked E thing is right there I'm looking at.
That's the symbol for sum.
I don't think letters belong in math. I never have, because math is for numbers only. So
those letters represent concepts that you want to measure.
I don't want to measure anything. Why do we have to measure concepts?
It's just shorthand so you don't have to write out the word every time.
Yeah, I know.
That's all the letters are.
I'm not nearly as dumb as I pretend to be.
I know you're not. Speed, velocity, delta D over delta T.
What is delta?
Delta just means change.
Okay.
It's the little triangle symbol. It just means the change. Because space and time and energy and force and work, all of these things are relative. Delta is very important in all of the physics equations that we use, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because in our modern world, everything is relative to everything else. That wasn't always the case, especially when you go back to some of these concepts like the hermetics, which seems like some of WalterRussell's work is drawn from that, which I think is one of the things that some of these principles that Terrence Howard uses for some of these theories are based on these concepts, which are sort of pre-relativity. And that's why I think a lot of science is going to have a hard time with some of the way he expresses them, because...
Well, I mean, they made fun of Einstein too, so, I mean, what's the point?
Yeah, they made fun of Einstein for a long time.
There's a quote about what he said. There was a book published, 100 Scientists Against the Theory of Relativity or something like that.
Right.
And he says about the book, if I was wrong, it would only take one.
That's exactly right. Well, it would take more than one because you want to be able to repeat every experiment. You can never trust a single experimental result. But his principle of gravity, this notion of gravity that he came up with, it wasn't able to be tested until 2020.
Right.
And he came up with it in 1915.
Right.
We created a machine that we believe measured a gravitational wave. And it's done it a few times now. And we think that there's theoretical proof of his concept of gravity's influence on space-time.
Just a learning curve, if you will.
Einstein's notion of gravity is something that I was going to bring up in the whole Terrence Howard conversation, because he's talking about how there's this idea that gravity may not work the way that we kind of think it might work. You know, there is scientific evidence that it theoretically exists in the way that it was theorized to exist. So that might shoot a giant hole in his theory that it's not part of the influence. But I think his larger point is that he thinks that electromagnetism is a much greater force in the universe. And I don't know that that's even refuted at least from an earthly perspective, that is 100% true in our experience of things on Earth. Electromagnetism as a force seems to be much greater than the force of gravity.
Mm-hmm.
But that's all relative. So, I don't know. I'd love to read more of this Walter Russell guy, but it's hard to read his stuff. It just doesn't make much sense to me when I try to read it. Entire books are written in that way.
Yeah, I know. Like I said, it's complicated.
It's not just complicated, it uses language that is based on some understanding of reality that doesn't make sense to me.
Well, it's all relative, man.
Yeah, it's all relative. I don't know where it's based on, though. You know what?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about math, you have to realize everybody's using the same math, right? You think, especially with the simple stuff, adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing. But then you get base 8, base 10, and math just gets more and more complicated exponentially.
Yes, it can. If you're reading like a modern physics paper in the Science Journal or whatever today, with the level of education that you and I have, we would both read that and be like, this is gobbledygook, it doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
But you could go and educate yourself and figure out what the fuck it was talking about if you dedicated the time to get your PhD in physics or whatever, and you learned all those concepts. You could take a basic physics course online. I mean, it's free. You could take an MIT physics course online and learn that, and you would be able to kind of piece it together and understand it. But some of this Walter Russell stuff, I don't know that you could do the same thing, because I'm not sure there's a basic course in what the hell it is he's talking about. But I could be totally wrong on that.
Well, I mean, you can get a degree in metaphysics now. You used to not be able to do that. So,
yeah.
Who knows?
And maybe that's what I need to do to have a intelligent discussion with you about it. It's like, go and read some of this. I'm not saying it's all garbage. I'm just saying I don't understand it.
Well, the universe is a complicated place, and we may never truly understand it. I hope one day that we do. So we're going to wrap that up. Unfortunately, due to the large gap in time between Walter Russell's time and our time currently, he's unavailable for reasons including death, and he's unable to talk about this himself. So we have to, with no real understanding of what's going on, as most everyday people stumble through life, because just the way of it. We go along to get along. We just really care about our next meal and making sure the electric bill's paid. These overcomplicated theories don't affect us. Thank you, JohnBuckson, for being here and joining me once again.
I'm happy to be here. I appreciate you having me. I hope you don't feel like I was beating you up. I wasn't trying to beat up the idea. I think there are many things that are very interesting in these ideas. I'd love to keep on talking about it if you want to.
Well, that would require us to get PhDs. And that's probably not going to happen anytime this week. So,
or maybe we could read some of that Walter Russell text.
Yeah, and then you'd have to get 7 dictionaries. Trust me, I've read esoteric things before. You're going to need dictionaries. You're going to need encyclopedias. You're going to need stuff to get an understanding of it, because none of this is simple to understand. And why I have taken it upon myself to try to make it simple for everyday people is beyond me. I think that if I didn't do this, they would probably put me in a straitjacket in a little white padded cell. These are the things that interest me. I think change is coming and needs to come faster than it is, and it's probably intentionally being delayed because, well, we don't want universal unity on this planet, because no one will have power over anybody else that way. Nobody's going to profit off of it that way. So
I want universal unity. That sounds good to me.
I mean, it sounds good to me too. That's why we started the show, trying to understand these principles, these immensely complex concepts that are over even our heads as we try to understand them. But maybe somebody out there who's listening gets some of this and would like to be like, hey, you guys are idiots, or you need a better host, or you need a better guest, or you need, I don't know, make the dog stop barking all the time. I don't know. People are going to say what they're going to say, and let them, because everybody's entitled to their own opinion.
Yeah, let us know. Send us an email. BlindAlchemyPodcast@gmail.com.
Yeah, do it. You know where to find us. We're everywhere now. We're on iHeartRadio. Did you know that? Ted, get your tongue out of there. That's gross. Oh, wait a minute. You had my hopes up. Okay, anyway, we're everywhere. You know where to find us. We're in the normal places you can find podcasts. So thanks for joining me. Thanks for joining me, listener. And you guys have a good day. Try to live a peaceful life in harmony with your octaves as we float through the sea of frequency that we call reality. Love you, ladies and gentlemen. Be safe out there.
We would love to receive your feedback and your questions for advice. Please email us or send us a voicemail. Our address is TheBlindAlchemyPodcast@gmail.com. Find, like, review, subscribe, and contact us on Facebook and YouTube at The Blind Alchemy Podcast, all one word. Please subscribe to this podcast on your podcast player. We are available on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, and Anchor.fm/TheBlindAlchemyPodcast. Please tell all your friends, enemies, and any strangers to listen to our podcast. This will help us bring joy to everyone. Text-to-speech services were provided by freetts.com and readloud.net. Some information was provided by wikipedia.org and the Joe Rogan Experience number 2171 on youtube.com. Please see the episode notes for full attribution. We would like to extend a special thank you to the world's greatest musicians, sound designers, and engineers at HairelineProductions for their help with the composition, performance, editing, production, and recording of both the original music and today's show. Please like their content on SoundCloud/HairelineProductions.